The Mystara project is proud to present part 23 of the Lore of Mystara series. In this video, we cover the period from BC 527 to BC 500, featuring the sudden collapse of the Nithian Empire. Between BC 527 and BC 429, in the caverns of Grak under the Plain of Fire in the Great Waste region, Grugrak gnolls continued to attack the Shialia elves, but over time these attacks slowed to occasional raids, and the elves became well established. Tense mistrustful negotiations were entered into between elves and gnolls, with some near disasters. Step 1 resulted in mutual language learning. Step 2 saw compromise, with agreement on territory. However, negotiations got complicated once the elves realized they lacked safe areas in certain seasons and wanted more territory. As the years passed, both races realized mutual cooperation could benefit all. The elves had magic, and the gnolls had local survival knowledge, but distrust got in the way. Eventually the leaders of both species ordered joint cooperation enterprises, with good behavior guaranteed by hostage exchanges. Hostages learned their host's culture. Eventually hostages were treated as guests. By no later than BC 429, some gnolls and elves started camping together. Leaders encouraged a child exchange program of a minimum of 1 year. Hostage-taking practices then ceased. Sometime between BC 525 and BC 500, Yav, posing as Mulogo, used his superior precognitive powers to reach the apex of the seer's hierarchy. He had to draw on his strong willpower to resist the urge to abuse his powers. In BC 510, various humanoid hordes migrated from the western to the eastern Hardanger Mountains, where they settle. Possibly, this is an error on the Gaz 10 tribal migrations map, and should be sometime between BC 500 and BC 492. Around BC 501, Nithians of the Savage Coast, assisted by their Hutakan slaves, crafted a black vessel into the shape of a Hutakan with a magical curse, to imprison a giant Crimson Death. They captured the creature in the vessel and sealed it in a dry silver mine in the Sierra del Plata. In BC 500, the Tralda were in the midst of their dark age. Communications between villages is infrequent, leading to widely different local dialects developing. The people now called themselves, and their land, Traladara. Hutakan buildings were shunned and left to ruin. Intermittent war and trade occurred between the isolated villages. By BC 500, the Nithian Empire had been weakened by 2 centuries of entropic corruption, devastating civil wars, ruler insanity and reduced rainfall. The balance of immortals of the spheres opposed to entropy, decreed that the entropic corruption of the Empire of Nithia was so ingrained, that it was to be destroyed, and mortal memories of it were to be removed. The immortals drove the Nithian rulers insane, in a drooling, foaming at the mouth, bouncing off the walls crazy way. Ranivorous was also spreading insanity among the Nithian elite, including their wizards. Nithian immortals, other than Thanatos and Ranivorous, denied clerical spells to their followers. Tectonic shifts led to a geological uplift of the northern highlands and the subsidence of the Alasian basin. This resulted in the headwaters of the river Nithia diverting onto the Usturt Plateau, and from there, into underground reservoirs of the Alasian desert. The river dried up, collapsing Nithia's agricultural base. Some believe the immortals assisted these seemingly natural changes. The Nithians started scattering to the 4 winds in search of water and fertile land. Rainfall also continued to reduce from climatic changes. For 3 centuries, elven weather magic, influenced by Ilsundal, that created Alfheim, had diverted rain away from the Nithian River Valley. Additionally, conflicts between Nithia's favored fire elementals and their enemies, the water elementals, led to less water generally. The remaining gnoll slaves revolted in north-central Nithia. The Black Moon gnolls flee west, eventually reaching the Sun's Anvil in the Broken Lands. In the caverns beneath the Sun's Anvil, they found South Nolistan. Gnoll followers of Ranivorous fled east, eventually arriving in the Hardanger foothills of the Angaisan River Valley. The region becomes known as Gnollheim. In response to the Immortals' decree to destroy Nithia, Thanatos intervened personally. He instructed the pharaoh to create an empire of undeath, reasoning that would solve the lack of water and food problems. This caused a group of Immortals to band together to destroy Thanatos. The Immortal Guardians battled Thanatos in a remote region of the Northern Highlands. Thanatos ripped open wormholes to dozens of planes and summoned his fire elemental allies. Magical fires, floods, earthquakes and gales scoured the earth to bedrock. The magical power unleashed caused the bedrock to flow like water, then burst to gas, then shatter into fragments, then be polished as smooth as glass by windblown sands. Immortals created an obsidian glass bowl to seal the wormholes that Thanatos had opened. This region is now known as the Dead Places. With Thanatos defeated, the Immortal Guardians evoked a spell of oblivion that wiped all mortal memory of Nithia, utterly destroying almost every artifact and the monumental architecture of the Nithians. To reduce the likelihood of knowledge of Nithia being rediscovered, the Old Man of the Sea, the Knoll and Zephyr created and placed an artifact, called the Bead of Oblivion, in the royal catacombs near Suramanra. The bead wiped any memory of Nithia from all who passed within 12 miles, unless a save versus spells at a -20 penalty was made. Possibly the Knoll could have been Fla, mistaken for a knoll. Given paragons may search for the bead as part of their quest, an energy immortal would be an appropriate co-creator. Or schizophrenic Ranivorous could have been working for both sides. He is rumored to have spread insanity among the rulers and wizards of Nithia. Zephyr could be another name for the Ethengarian wind immortal, Krisha. Immortals also sent their servitors after mortals who knew too much about Nithia, and helped them forget. It is speculated that Thanatos was assisted by his secret ally Corona. Possibly Corona was an immortal of the Plane of Fire, or the Fire Master himself. Regardless, the Plane of Fire immortals abandoned the Nithian Magian fire worshippers. The Thoshans were spared by the immortals, as they had never followed Thanatos. They were left with vague legends and memories that they were once a mighty people of the Isle of Dawn, but the immortals abandoned them. They believed their ancestors came from far away and died out long ago. They then turned to a new brand of mysticism, but some still followed Ra. Their economy suffered from the cessation of trade with Nithia. That, combined with their loss of faith, left them confused, panicked and dismayed. Alphatian troops moved in to restore order, and to some extent out of pity. King Haptethep, pharaoh of Thoshar, abandoned his research into developing an enchantment to breach the sky shield, and fled to Upper Thoshar. Alphatian forces sacked Dido and the pharaoh's palace, taking or destroying some of Haptethep's magical papyruses. Alphatians began settling the Isle of Dawn, which was now absorbed into the empire. They renamed abandoned Thoshan settlements of bogland such as Dunnerdale and Deirdren, where mostly farmers without magical ability settled. The Immortals also spared the innocent Nithian followers of Oris's, who were permitted to be removed to Oris's home outer plane under their immortal supervision. Oris's successfully persuaded an immoral tribunal to leave one outpost of 108 of his followers on Mystara to safeguard against the threat of any reawakened dark powers of Nithia. Oris's agreed that these followers would never speak to any outsiders to preserve the secret of Nithian evils. This outpost became the White Knight Order of Druids on White Island in the Colony Isles. Ether weirds were placed in spring-fed pools on the island by Oris's to be commanded by the Druids should they be required against reawakened Nithian evil. The Minroth traders were also spared. They never followed Thanatos, following mainly Minroth instead. They had started distancing themselves from Nithia when the corruption started. They were now officially independent. In the northern reaches, the Nithians and traces of Nithia had completely faded by BC 490. The Nithian collapse left the weak northern reaches human tribal cultures at the mercy of local giant clans. Spellcasting stagnated in the region for a millennia. On the Colony Isles, the last remaining Malfegi lizard man lair had become infected. The doomed lizardmen's shamans and Wakani finally discovered the source of the disease, the Nithians. Enraged, and encouraged by their immortal Ka, the lizard men unleashed unearthly spells of unimaginable potency and went on a killing frenzy, wiping out the Nithian colonists, and destroying their settlements, in a single night, before perishing themselves within weeks. The next morning, the Makai were independent and could not remember being any other way. Unfortunately, some Makai perished in the destruction of the Nithian settlements. Ka transported 12 Malfegi lizard men to the Hollow World swamps and cured them. Several primitive lizardmen clans survived in the pestilent swamps of Royster Island. One subspecies of amphibious lizardmen survived in submerged tunnel settlements on the floors of the deepest lagoons, and on the shallow coastal shelves of the western sunlit sea. The lizardmen also spared goblin slaves of the Nithians who survived the destruction. The goblins fled to the lava fields around volcanoes, where they found, and settled in, lava caves. Thracian slaves revolted against their Nithian masters on the jungle coast, destroying Nithian buildings, and slaughtered Nithians. They split into 4 separate tribes and took their tribal names from local fauna, being the raven, the leopard, the jackal and the rhino. They then turned their attention to harassing the Mylenians, who presumably had at least a non-aggression pact with the Nithian colony. The Nithians vanished. The Nithians also disappeared almost overnight from the savage coast, leaving their Hutakan slaves to fend for themselves. A few pyramids escaped destruction, and the legacy of Nithian art and philosophy remained. Savage Coast people incorrectly attributed some Nithian artifacts as Walleran. The Nithian capital city of Rannoch was mostly cleansed of corruption, then transported to the Hollow World by the Immortals, chiefly Ra, Fla and Ka. The people were given false memories that they were native to the Hollow World. One of the more prominent transported Nithians was Kepha, a powerful, secretive cleric who didn't deal much with the living, who became the first pharaoh in the Hollow World. However, Thanatos used all of his power to hide his chosen cleric, Sekhaba, from the cleansing immortals, so he was also transported to the Hollow World. Also some of Tophos' centuries-old abominations in the deep catacombs were missed in the cleansing. Slave revolts occurred throughout the empire. Alassians won their freedom and lived as coastal tribes, or retreated to the interior desert to live a nomadic lifestyle. The surviving heartland Nithians were absorbed by Alassian culture on the coastal plain and in the desert. Some were not absorbed, and regressed to tribal lifestyles in the northern highlands. The Nithian warrior Madarua became a wandering adventurer. Fla was insulted by the Nithians' betrayal. He turned his back on the affairs of the outer world, including his Hutakan followers. He set up a Hutakan colony in the Hollow World, and started focusing on his Hollow World Nithian and Hutakan followers. Although the Canolbarth forest was substantially completed in BC 700, it was completely finished in BC 500. Canolbarth was the foremost elven wizard of its creation, hence the forest was named in his honor. The Thyacian tribes completed their conquest of the Tauralai lands, assimilating the survivors. The Korendan tribe occupied the western plains, the Thyacians held the central lands up to the now Alassian-held Tel Akbir Peninsula in the east. The Hattians occupied the southern peninsula. The Immortals transported some Tauralai to the Hollow World to preserve their culture. In the absence of the Nithian Empire, the Thyacians commenced centuries-long piratical raids in the Sea of Dread and Western Sea of Dawn. Some gnomes migrated from the Altan Tepe Mountains to the eastern Vendarian ranges, and found Torkin Fall, near the Three Fires volcanoes. Artsanteotl had become increasingly offended by the Nithians, ever since they defiled his Broken Lands temple by their presence in BC 1050. When the Nithian Empire was destroyed, he caused his temple and the buried city of Ingmar to sink into the earth, sealing the volcano shaft, to avoid further interference. The chained Nightwing portal in the temple provided power from an entropic outer plane to keep Ingmar afloat in the lava. Only Artsanteotl's faithful followers survived the descent. The followers then discovered the abandoned city of Ingmar. By BC 500, the Eastwind clan had founded the village of Favaro on the east bank of the Streel River, near Alfheim. Alphatian wizards interested in non-human races conquered the monster lands of Lim, in western Alphatia, but allowed the monsters the option to live by Alphatian law. Creatures capable of spellcasting were allowed to become aristocrats. Lim became part of the imperial territory of Alphatia. Yav, masquerading as Mulogo, proclaimed himself the herald of the immortal Yav to his people. He preached that the immortal was angry because his people had not taken his message to heart. He told them, to appease Yav's wrath, they must abandon these lands and flee from the Serpent Peninsula. A devastating earthquake, that no other seer had foreseen, helped back Mulogo's claims. Led by Mulogo, the people built an enormous fleet of ships and sailed across the Izondian Deep to the Immortal's arm. Not everyone followed Mulogo. The people of Quagmire remained. Demiogres from Tangor sailed east across the Strait of Tangor and settled the west coast of the Central Immortals Arm region. The of the Kingdom of Aeril observed their movements and grew concerned. The chief immortal of the Walleraz, Agungi the Rainbow Serpent, elsewhere known as the Great One, discovered that the Walleraz had devolved to Stone Age technology. He then learnt that this was caused by the Harathian spell of forgetting. The Great One then shed his blood over the savage coast to prevent Harathians from scrying the region. The Great One's blood became a magical substance called verme when it reacted with the soil, and enhanced the Nithian enchantment over the region, which would manifest in spell-like powers later known as legacies. With Harathian scrying blocked, the Great One sent a plague of dragons to attack Herath. The dragons created creatures of mixed dragon, wasp and other species to create Frulorns to hunt the Aranir. It was only the intervention of the Harathians' chief immortal Yem, elsewhere known as Karotiku, that saved their nation. Karotiku convinced the Great One to cease the attacks, saying the Harathians had made a mistake and would never interfere with the Walleraz again. Herath destroyed all traces of the spell of forgetting, and forbade research of this type of magic. With the end of the Dragon War, the Harathians dumped their lizardmen slaves and servants into the bayou, after they failed to live up to expectations. The Harathians found them crude. The lizardmen reproduced quickly in the bayou, and spread out to surrounding lands. Influenced by Menlil, elsewhere known as Artsanteotl, the Soktars develop makeup to protect them from the sun. They then emerged in Nimmor and offered to assist the Induks in their struggle against the orcs of the Dark Jungle. After the orcs had been beaten back, the Soktars started assassinating key Nimmurians. The Induks drove the Soktars from their cities. The Soktars, assisted by Herath, further betrayed their Induk hosts, by rising from their underground kingdom in full force and attacking. The Induks used their star monuments to great effect to beat the Soktars at the Battle of Umni Lesser. But the Soktars captured all the Induk cities and burnt all their ships. Before the fall of each city, the Induks destroyed all their star monuments except the one in the ziggurat of King Arshu of Nimmor sent a hearty messenger across the Strait of Yalu to seek the ERS help to flee Nimmor. The messenger returned with good news. The Induks removed all their sacred runes and set up magical simulacra in the ziggurat of to lure the Soktars into the city. That night the Induks of flew over the city walls after moonfall. They then marched to a cliff south of Ekidu where the mounted on giant eagles, awaited. The king summoned a mighty wind to assist their journey. The eagles carried nets to allow Induks to rest when too tired to fly. The Soktars poured into the city of and stormed the great ziggurat. Reaching the main hall, the Soktars attacked and slew the simulacra of Induk priests. Fatally wounded, Sarshurgan, the high priest of Edu, escaped the ziggurat of with the key and viewing crystal that controlled the celestial power collector. He entrusted the devices to a Walleran before dying. The Walleran buried the priest and key, then sealed the tomb and headed back to Wallera. The Soktars tracked the Induks to the cliff south of Akidu, where they also found soft human-like boot prints and white feathers. They saw a reef below the prevented escape by ship. The puzzled Manscorpions left and returned to celebrate their conquest of Gilmoon in the name of Menlil. The Induks and the made it across the Strait of Yalu. The permitted the Induks to settle the large plateau in the center of the Immortals' Arm region, if they would assist the winged elves clear it of monsters. This they achieved, and set up the kingdom of Ashu, named after their priest king. Priest King Ashu built the fortress of Gildesh at the entrance to the Gildesh Pass. The Soktar Manscorpions usurp Nimmurian culture. They hand over Enduk captives to the Harathians for magical experimentation, as a reward for their assistance in the invasion. Ninhurabi, also known as Nyx, was appalled by Menlil's manipulation of the Soktars to the surface, their betrayal of the Induks, and his shabby makeup device. Fearing some Manscorpions may have escaped his curse, Edu, also known as Ixion, tried to catch any remaining ones on the Savage Coast. He stated that those who sought power on the Savage Coast would be doomed by it. Their bodies would become deformed and their mental abilities diminished. However, Edu's curse was not limited to the Manscorpions. 3 powerful forces on the Savage Coast, the Great One's blood, which had become Vermeil, the Nithian enchantments, and Ixion's curse, combined into the Red Curse. However, the Harathians were able to contain the Red Curse to the eastern Savage Coast through their powerful magic. Fearing the Red Curse and Harathian revenge, many dragons left the Savage Coast. Some who remained were transformed by the Red Curse into the first Crimson Dragons. This concludes Part 23 of the Lore of Mystara series, featuring the far-reaching impact of the fall of the Nithian Empire.